In a world where fandoms collide, where epic stories shape our lives, and where passion for all things geeky connects us across time and space. Welcome to the Geek Unified Theory. Hosted by the one and only Jeffrey Harlan, your guide through the worlds of heroes, villains, and everything in between. Grab your controller, pick up your favorite graphic novel, and settle in for the ride. It's time for the Geek Unified Theory. Hey geeks, welcome to Geek Unified Theory, Episode 1. I'm your host, Jeffrey Harlan. In this episode, we'll discuss the podcast itself. What's the history behind it? What will the show cover? We'll also talk about me, your host. Who am I? What's my background? This episode is brought to you by my book, Donner und Blitzkrieg, Book 1 of the Minutemen. As the Korean War drew to a close, Stephen and Percy discovered they had superpowers. Becoming the world's first superheroes, Nucleus and Strongman, the pair found themselves at the forefront of a wave of superhumans. When Donner, the superpowered son of Nazi war criminals, attacks, the two heroes find themselves thrust into a leadership role, and failure could mean the rise of a new Reich. Donner und Blitzkrieg is available through my website, jeffreyharlan.com, and can be found at retailers around the world. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the history of Geek Unified Theory. We're also going to talk a little bit about me, your host. And to start off with, what is a geek? According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a geek is an enthusiast or expert, especially in a technological field or activity. Geek became synonymous with nerd in the 1950s, and has similarly seen increasing use with positive connotations, highlighting membership in a specialized group rather than social awkwardness. Originally, Geek Unified Theory started as a blog in 2020 during the pandemic lockdown. It was something that I wanted to do to kind of join in with some of those other sites out there that were doing like news and article features on basically just geek culture, geek history. It lasted for about a year, and then it kind of fell by the wayside as the pandemic lockdown ended, and it just, it was lower priority because I had other things that were taking time away from that I was dedicating to it. I was working on trying to save up money, rebuild my credit, and buy a house. And then I was moving and finding a new job, so everything just kind of fell by the wayside. I merged all the content with my author site, jeffreyharlan.com, and the site geekunifiedtheory.com expired. The domain registration expired, and then I just, I didn't forget about it, but it became a lower priority. I was focusing more on my novels and other things. But now I'm resurrecting it as a podcast. I've taken all the old content. I've renewed the registration on the domain name. The website is back. The content from the old website is back. It's all still there. I had a backup of it. And it's, like I said, it's at geekunifiedtheory.com. Primarily, this podcast is going to be a solo endeavor. It's just going to be me talking about things with geek history, geek culture, fandom, comic books, movies, TV shows, novels, books, things like that. Things that we are passionate about as geeks. I'm here to entertain and inform you. I'm also planning to have interviews down the line with other people that bring something that I can't. I'm also going to talk about some specific shows, like Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, Robotech, Transformers, all those kinds of things that we are just really into. Now, I'm sure you're asking, who is Jeffrey Harlan? I'm what you might call a prenatal geek. I grew up with sci-fi and fantasy since birth. My mom and my dad were both science fiction fans, and so I've just been surrounded by that my entire life. They took me to see Star Trek the Motion Picture in the theater when I was 2 years old. And then I spent the next several months trying to do a Vulcan neck pinch with, shall we say, limited success on my brother. Beyond Star Trek, I also watched Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, Doctor Who, Blake 7, just all kinds of different shows. This was early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. I watched all kinds of stuff. That's just what we did as a family. We would watch TV shows like that and have a good time watching them. I'm also a huge comic book geek. I started collecting in the late 80s when I was about 10, 11. I started with Transformers comic books because I was really into Transformers. And then I branched out from there into other comic books like X-Men, Spider-Man, Superman. When they had the Death of Superman storyline in 93, and then that spun off with the other Supermen that appeared in the aftermath, I became a huge fan of Tom Grummett's and Carl Kessel's work on Superboy. And that was one of the first series that I was going out of my way to make sure that I got every issue. And I just really enjoyed, reading those comics and, seeing those adventures and having, all that entertainment. It was a lot of fun. Now I am an author of speculative fiction, a member of the Science Fiction Writers Association. I started my writing career writing fan fiction in the 1990s. I'm a Star Trek fan, so I wrote Star Trek fanfic in the 1990s, and that helped me build confidence as a writer, and it helped me improve my my technique and my craft. And what I really wanted to do, though, was write comic books. So in the late 90s, I really started developing my ideas, but it wasn't until 2012 that I published my first issue of The Protectorate. It was a comic book that I'd been, percolating in my brain and working on at different stages ever since I was in middle school, really. And I produced 4 issues of The Protectorate as an independent comic book over the course of about 5 years, I believe. It proved to be much more difficult to produce a comic book than I had anticipated, so it took a very long time, especially since I was also working and going to school at that time as well. So I had a lot of things going on my plate. But I still managed to put out 4 issues. The 5th issue that would have wrapped up the storyline remains unfinished. But the story that I had come up with as the backstory for the world of the Protectorate was that there were decades of superheroes in the history of this world. And that became my novel, Donner und Blitzkrieg. I read a lot of other prose superhero fiction, like the novelizations of The Death and Return of Superman, Nightfall, and then I'm a huge fan of the the series Wearing the Cape. And that one kind of inspired me to take the backstory that I developed and turn that into a novel. So that became my novel, Donner und Blitzkrieg. I discovered while writing that novel that I really enjoyed writing superheroes as prose fiction more so than I enjoyed writing the comic book scripts and then drawing those comics. For one thing, it was a lot faster. I could put a lot more stories out in less time. But, and since I published that, I've also published 2 more novels. I completed the story from The Protectorate as the first novel of that series, Invasion. That takes those first 4 issues, plus the story from the incomplete 5th issue, and puts it together as a novel. My 3rd book that came out in 2024, that is Crusaders, the sequel to Donner und Blitzkrieg. Another thing is that I run a website called Trekipedia. It's trekipedia.com. I've run that since 1998. And that thing, it started out as a repository for my fanfiction. I'd write fanfic, I'd post it on Usenet, and then I'd archive it on my website. At the time, I called it FedNet, the Federation Network. But eventually I changed the name because as I'm building up all these stories, I'm developing like my own alternate universe because I'm taking things in a totally different direction than they did on the shows. And so I started creating an encyclopedia on the site detailing some of the differences between the TV Star Trek universe and my fanfiction Star Trek universe. Eventually I stopped writing the fanfiction, like in the early 2000s. And I decided, well, I'm just going to keep doing that encyclopedia because I was enjoying that. And I kept updating those articles. And around 2005, that's when Memory Alpha got started. And wikis being wikis, that thing just exploded. And there's just a massive amount of content on that because you got hundreds, if not thousands of people updating it. With Trekipedia, it's just me. But I decided I've got a degree in history. And I have a very specific take on how to do an encyclopedia because of that. I'm trying to approach this from a much more, professional historian perspective. And so I'm very detailed with my footnotes and attribution of everything that I put on the site. And I discovered a couple of years ago that some of the writers' rooms for the recent Star Trek series, they were going to Memory Alpha. They were checking that site for fact-checking on their scripts. But then they were fact-checking Memory Alpha with Trekipedia. Because I guess I've established that it's a trustworthy site. And that's, kind of a feather in my cap. And I feel pretty good about that. I also used to do a Star Trek podcast back in, it was about 2015, 2016, so about 10 years ago. I did a couple of podcasts. I was the co-host for 2 podcasts on the Trek FM network. Standard Orbit for the original Star Trek series and Warp 5 for Star Trek Enterprise. I did those with my friends Norm Lau, Will Wynn, and Ken Tripp. And I learned a lot about producing a podcast doing those shows. I did that for about a year. I eventually had to stop because, again, I was very busy with a lot of other things going on. I was going back to school again. And I had just gotten married, and a lot of other things were going on, so I had a a lot of stuff, and I just couldn't dedicate the time that I needed to produce the podcast. But I learned a lot in that year that I did work on the shows. And a lot of that credit goes to Christopher Jones, the guy who started the whole thing over at Trek FM. He had very demanding standards for the podcast shows on the Trek FM network. And I want to apply those same standards to my own podcast. So that's a lot of what I'm bringing to the table here. I've got a lot of background and experience and knowledge with both geek culture and history, a lot of the different shows and media that we like to consume, and also some experience making a podcast, running a podcast on a topic like Star Trek, which again ties directly into what I want to do with this show. I have a wide online presence. I post on social media quite a bit, actually. I'm on Blue Sky at jeffreyharlan.com. Rather than doing the whole blue checkmark thing like X, formerly Twitter, Blue Sky has a verification that your username is your website, and it can only become your website if you add some code onto your website so that they can verify that the website belongs to you. It's a rather clever way of doing things, and so my Blue Sky handle for myself is jeffreyharlan.com. Instagram, I'm at Harlander77. Now, the name Harlander comes from when I was in the military, because my last name is Harlan, and one of the guys that I worked with said Harlander, and then he realized that sounded like Highlander, and he's like, Harlander, there can be only one. Every time he saw me, it caught on, and people started calling me Harlander. So that is now my handle on several social media sites. So Instagram, Harlander77. Mastodon, at Harlander at writing.exchange. And again, my website is jeffreyharlan.com. This week in Geek. A feature I had on the original website was a weekly blog post called This Week in Geek. And I would detail things that had happened in geek history, and I would also highlight a few things that were coming up in the future. I'm resurrecting that as a segment on the podcast, but since I'm going to be releasing every 2 weeks, I will be doing 2 weeks of This Week in Geek. But I'm still keeping the name because it sounds, I like the rhyming. So for the week of January 1st through 5th, 2025, January is National Clean Up Your Computer Month in the U.S. Our computers build up a lot of dust and debris inside the cases. You want to clean that stuff up because it can cause a lot of problems like overheating and eventual breakdown of the parts. So clean out the inside of your computers. Clean up your keyboards. There's a lot of junk that builds up in there. January is also National Hobby Month. As geeks, we have a lot of hobbies like model making, collecting, all kinds of stuff like that. January 1st is the anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, by Mary Shelley in 1818. It's long considered the one of the first, if not the first, science fiction novels. The Prophet of Dune, which would later be adapted as the first part of the first Dune novel, was serialized beginning in January of 1965 in Analog magazine. Also on January 1st, Ender's Game was published in 1985. And January 1st is Public Domain Day. There's a lot of notable works that enter the public domain every year on January 1st. For 2025, and this is U.S. Public domain laws, because copyright laws vary from country to country. So one country, something may be coming public domain, but other countries it may not. So make sure to check your local laws. But in the U.S., January 1st, 2025, some notable works that are entering the public domain include Popeye and Buck Rogers, the comic strip version of Buck Rogers. In the novel, which is already in the public domain, he was Anthony Rogers, but the comics introduced the name Buck Rogers. January 2nd is National Science Fiction Day. It's an unofficial holiday created to coincide with Isaac Asimov's birthday in 1920. January 3rd, likewise, is J.R.R. Tolkien Day, which celebrates his birthday in 1892. January 3rd is also the anniversary of the premiere of Star Trek Deep Space Nine in 1993. January 4th is National Trivia Day in the U.S. And as geeks, what do we love more than trivia? So go ahead, bust out your copy of Star Trek Trivial Pursuit, see if you can convince your friends to play against you again, all of them against you at once, and beat them all collectively as a team against you. Not that I have any experience in that. Moving on. January 4th is also Perihelion Day. This is the day that the Earth is at its closest point in its orbit to the Sun. And because the Earth's orbit is elliptical, it also shifts over time. So every 58 years, Perihelion Day actually moves to a different day. January 5th will be the Golden Globe Awards. And there are a lot of science fiction and fantasy movies that are, and television shows that are being honored or nominated at the awards. This year, Dune Part 2 is up for 2 awards, including Best Picture for Drama and Best Original Score by Hans Zimmer. Wicked is up for 4 awards, including Best Picture for Musical or Comedy, Cinematic and Box Office Achievement, Best Actress for Cynthia Erivo, and Best Supporting Actress for Ariana Grande. Inside Out 2 is up for 2 awards, including Best Picture for Animated and Cinematic and Box Office Achievement. Moana 2 is up for Best Picture for Animated. The Wild Robot is up for 3 awards, including Best Picture, Animated, Best Original Score, and Best Original Song. Alien Romulus, Beetlejuice, Deadpool and Wolverine are all up for Cinematic and Box Office Achievement. The Penguin Limited Series is up for Best TV Limited Series, Best Actress for Kristen Milotti, and Best Actor for Colin Farrell. House of the Dragon is up for Best Actress for Emma Darcy. And Agatha All Along is up for Best Actress for Kathryn Hahn. So, best of luck to all of them. And that'll be streaming live on Paramount Plus and airing live on CBS. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe, and join us next time when we'll explore how geek culture became a global phenomenon. Visit us at our website, geekunifiedtheory.com. On social media at facebook.com/geekunifiedtheory, Instagram at Geek Unified Theory, and Blue Sky at geekunifiedtheory.com. Recorded and mastered by Jeffrey Harlan. Music by Ovani Sound and Hyperreal Records, used under license. Geek Unified Theory is a production of Confluent Press Audio. Copyright 2025, Jeffrey Harlan, DBA, Confluent Press. All rights reserved.